Okay, and today we're just going to talk a little bit about Representative Ilhan Omar, the replacement for the domestic violence offender, I guess you would call it, Keith Ellison, former member of the Nation of Islam, who I guess now belongs to the bigger cult of Islam, not just the smaller, less reputable quasi-Islamic black nationalist cult. But that's the topic for another day. I wanted to talk about Ilhan Omar and the public relations debacle for the Democratic Party, which is now scurrying to pretend like the two hijabi congresswomen that they lauded and praised and ushered into Congress in virtually races that really didn't have any competition, despite the fact that the people we were electing were radical Islamists, devout followers of Muhammad. And something I noticed is that even before Representative Omar revealed her cards, so to speak, before she came out and accused Jews of being manipulative, money grubbing. Basically, the only thing that's left for her now is for her to trot out the blood libel, to come onto the floor of the House with a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. She really has nowhere to go in terms of just revealing to the country what people who are followers of Muhammad truly believe. But I noticed even before this latest incident, where she accused people that support Israel of being in the pay of AIPAC, which doesn't actually. It's, I guess, it's the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. It's basically a lobbying group to help promote Israel and support for Israel in Congress. But whether or not you like or dislike AIPAC, the basic undercurrent of her statement was that people in Congress who support Israel support because they're being paid, which is the same sort of dumb. It's the same facile kind of third grade reasoning for people who look at politicians. Like, they see these broad general interest lobbies or things like the NRA or even I suppose that the NRA is a good example, because people in this country want to protect the Bill of Rights and they support the Second Amendment. And the reason the NRA has support is because they're at least viewed as supporting the Second Amendment. Now, in reality, a lot of people accuse them of, and this is a very accurate criticism, of being a very feckless, sort of pro-Republican, basically like pro-Republican hangers on in Washington. They don't really do anything to protect the Second Amendment, and there are much smaller grassroots groups that do a much better job, like the Second Amendment Foundation. But my point is, there's this sort of very facile understanding of of these groups, which says that they exist, that they pay congressmen money to support something like the Second Amendment, or in terms of foreign policy, Israel rather than the Palestinians. And they fail to understand the fact that people support Israel because they view it as better than having an Islamic State in the middle of a bunch of other Islamic states. If Israel wasn't there, the land would be controlled essentially by Islamic lunatics who despise the U.S. and it would just basically be a breeding ground for suicide bombers. And regardless if Israel was controlled by Jews, even if it was controlled by Muslims, not Muslims, even if it was controlled by Buddhists or Hindus or just animists, people who believed in Shintoism, it would still be a better alternative than handing it over to people whose religion dictates that they go out and suppress and conquer infidels or kafir. So, I mean, there's also a religious component to support for Israel, which I don't really have time to get into, but basically the reason there's a practical reason that Israel supported, and this is something that people like Representative Omar do not understand. Now, the problem for the Democratic Party is that they have to keep ingratiating themselves to these people because Muslims, particularly in places like Michigan, but even in other states like New York City is a good example. There are, I think, close to 1 million Muslims. I'm not somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million, depending upon what statistics you use, statistical barometer you use. They're a huge percentage. They're more than, I would say, 10% of the population. And even though a lot of these people aren't registered to vote, a lot of them are, and a lot of them are potential voters. And you need to cater to them. And the fact is, these are people that, by and large, despise Israel. They don't view it as a state that has a right to exist. In contrast to the 50 plus some Muslim states and the 22 Arab states, they don't think Israel has a right to exist. And even people like Omar, who comes from Somalia, who's a refugee who came here through immigration fraud. A lot of people brought this up, but she essentially married her brother. Even people like her, she lives in a country where there are no Jews. There are literally 0 Jews, and only 1% of the population is Christian, and they're relentlessly persecuted. So even she, from this country, despises Jews. And the balancing act the Democratic Party has to do is to retain support among the Jewish community, which supports Democrats predominantly by somewhere on the order of 60 or 70%, and appealed to a growing Muslim community that's, if immigration patterns persist, is probably going to outstrip the Jewish population in the coming decades. And we already have a little under 1% of the U.S. House. I believe 4 congressmen, I could be mistaken, 4 Congress people are Muslim right now. So they have to figure out how they can reconcile these two things, just like they have to figure out how they can reconcile radical feminism and Islamism. And as we saw in Iran, this doesn't work. The left tried to marry itself to the Khomeinist, insane Shia revolution, and they wound up walking the gangplank, just like in the French Revolution, the Girondin party was eventually just pushed out by the Jacobins. And I mean, this is how it works. This is how politics works. So I don't see how they're going to be able to resolve this. They're trying to create this, fully automated luxury space gay Islamist communism, and I don't see how they're going to square the circle, but should be interesting to watch.